Is the TikTok ban about national security? Are there consequences for lying in politics? And should we embrace a 44.6% capital gains tax? We answer these questions and more on this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. This is the show where we go through the internet and find the most outrageous takes, and we try to break down what we like and don't like about them. My name is Donald. I'm here with my co-host Britt, and as a reminder, we would love it if you follow us on socials. Good Take, Bad Take Pod on Instagram, Bad Take Pod on Twitter and YouTube, and make sure to leave us a comment or a like. Tell us what we got right or wrong. We'd love to hear it, love to engage. Without anything else to say, let's move to our first take. All right, this first one comes from Seth Dillon of the Babylon Bee. He tweets, "Rationality doesn't revel in skepticism. It accepts what is reasonable and rejects what is not. The man who questions everything is just as foolish as the man who questions nothing." What do you make of this take?
I'm assuming this is probably kind of related to the Jeremy Boring take that we did. We'll be coming out here in a minute. In a vacuum, I really like it. I mean, he's right. I think you and I both experienced, at least because when I was homeschooled, like I was in classrooms with insanely smart people that usually only ever asked really good questions or needed to like clarify things that were not clear. But once I got to college, I was now mixed in with the dirty public schoolers, and
Ooh, scary.
to be fair, the person I'm actually thinking of that was asking questions that were dumb was a homeschooler. So.
Yeah.
But like you'd be in class and like someone would just ask a question because they're like, well, if I ask a question, then it seems like I'm like paying attention and being smart, but it was really a dumb question. And like all the rest of the class knew the answer to the question. So really this person was just wasting everyone's time. Or they would ask a question so dumb that like the presenter or the professor or the guest speaker wouldn't really know how to answer it. It would kind of stump them, but not because it was like a brilliant question, but because it was like, I don't know how to respond to something so dumb. So like that's like to me what this take is about. Like there are people that are like that. They're like, well, I'm brilliant because I'm so skeptical, because I ask questions about everything, doubting, the thing that my very eyes see. But I'm not really sure. I think this was related to the whole Jeremy Boring dropping the bomb on Japan, sort of thing and questioning that. And this type of thought and process really only works in a society where we actually have general agreements on what actually is reasonable. And I don't think we do have any sorts of those types of consensus, because I obviously like someone who would consider themselves within maybe the same side of the Overton window with us, like Jeremy Boring, like we have vastly different opinions on the reasonableness of burning children alive in Japan to stop a war. And so like we've kind of like lost the plot in some of these things. And like he would claim that I'm not being reasonable for questioning that by questioning that, I'm just reveling in my own skepticism and cynicalness about, U.S. foreign policy. But I'm not. I'm just saying like, hey, I see something here that looks unreasonable to me, and I'm asking questions about it. So I don't know. It's like, it's both a great take, and like also like when applied can be kind of weird because it doesn't really scale well, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I see it mostly as a good take, and then if you put it in context, this could be a subtweet to that, and it probably is, but without that tint, I think it's a good take. Now, if you put it in that tint, there's some examples I think that are really interesting to examine where I think skepticism needed to be pushed where it wasn't. For instance, I watched a clip of Matt Walsh, the Daily Wire's Matt Walsh, who of all of the Daily Wire people is probably the closest on foreign policy. And he was on with Piers Morgan. And Matt Walsh, I think, was at least having a reasonable position of saying, like, look, like, I don't think it's crazy to ask the question if this is in fact, if it was worthwhile doing. Like, clearly it was a major decision that impacted the lives of so many people in devastating ways. So I don't think it's unfair to ask the question. Yes, yeah, dropping the bomb. Sorry, yeah, for the context there of dropping the atom bomb on Japan. And then Piers Morgan goes on this thing of saying, because Matt Walsh puts it in the perspective of amount of lives lost and innocent lives, and Piers Morgan goes with the very tired talking point of, well, clearly it saved lives because of the thousands of people that Japan was killing of its own citizens and the thousands of lives extra loss that would have been lost from American troops when we would have had to do a land invasion. And Matt Walsh kind of just sits there and says, well, sure, accept. And he just accepts all these premise. And I'm like, whoa. The land invasion was not a foregone conclusion. Like, that is, first of all, like, that's the number one premise you need to be skeptical and challenge. And so in that way, this take doesn't, it doesn't work because, for instance, rationality, it's not reasonable to accept that a land invasion was necessary in that context. But for instance,
but we've been taught that for forever.
Yeah, right. And it's like, no, you need to actually question that, because like when Dwight Eisenhower says that it wasn't going to be necessary and they were ready to surrender, like maybe you need to reevaluate and rethink. You can't just accept that more American lives would have been lost. But for instance, I think the take makes sense if you think the measuring stick of what is right and wrong here should be the preservation of lives and peace. That to me is something where it's like, well, do we actually want to preserve peace, or do we actually want to save lives? That to me that's when you're at the point of, okay, now you're beyond rationality. And this example I've had at university, in the I remember I was traveling to a tournament and with the team, and there was a guy on our team who
for debate
who had no this guy had no substantive arguments ever. And we were talking about abortion. And I was kind of doing the thing where you're like, okay, well, if like what constitutes life, do we separate human life and personhood from the lives of animals and all these kinds of things, trying to get him to admit that abortion was in fact taking a life and was in fact taking a human life that we value more. And he gets to the point where I don't think he actually had an argument to go beyond this, but he says something along the lines of, well, he's like, well, I'm okay with the idea of taking the life then. Like, I'm okay with that. He just accepted bit. I'm like, okay, well then we don't even have a common ground to talk about this on, because if you're saying that it's justified to murder an innocent human life that you recognize has done nothing wrong, and the only reason you're killing it is for your own position of power and convenience, then we aren't on that. And that's what this strikes me as too, where it's like you're questioning the validity of like, well, do we really want to preserve life? Well, is it, is protecting an innocent human life, is it really just like, that's to the point where it's like, okay, we reject this. And the last thing I will say, where I think this take does make sense, is when you talk about praxeology. And a lot of people in economic or scientific circles will reject praxeology. Praxeology is this belief that you have to make reasonable assumptions about things. Like, for instance, you have to have the sort of axiom that people, generally speaking, work in their best self-interest. If someone has the option of taking a sandwich for free with no cost to himself for his lunch, like someone offers him a sandwich and there's no other factors, he will generally do that thing. That's sort of a praxeological view that you can assume that generally people work towards their own best interests. Now, what those interests are, you're not always going to know, but that's just a general axiom. And there are people who will reject this and say, well, you need to actually prove that. Like, do you have the data? Do you have the stats? Do you have the scientific theory that would prove that people want to work towards their best interest? And this is something that a lot of Austrian economists will reject and say, no, you have to make assumptions about how human behavior operates without proving it. And my favorite thing ever on this was Bob Murphy was talking about how people who oppose praxeology will say, well, you'd have to prove praxeology by the scientific method. And he said, but the scientific method isn't even verified to be the best way to measure these things by the scientific method. Its own standard of verifying things, this using the scientific method, is not itself verified by the scientific method. And so he's saying, no matter what, you have to hold some level of praxeological belief. They just choose to draw that line at the scientific method, that is the only way to rationally discover things, but you have to irrationally come to the conclusion that is the rational way to discover things. So that's another aspect where this take actually struck with me. He's probably not thinking, I heard Bob Murphy on this podcast talking about praxeology, but I did think that it is insightful there, because you drive yourself to the lengths of absurdity when you try to measure human behavior down to charts and data and equations as well. And when it comes to knowing how people are going to respond to things or behave, or having to prove it, there's a level of rationality, which is to say, like, no, there are certain things we can assume and take for granted, believe it or not. And if you're just at the point of questioning everything with accepting nothing, you don't actually have anything to found your ideas on. You have to at some point have to believe something, right? And for I think for libertarianism, it's the belief in self-ownership and private property rights and these kinds of things as your base principles. But even then, like, people could delve into ridiculous levels beyond that to say, well, what does that actually mean? And what is a person? And those questions are fine at a certain point, but if you want to operate in the real world, you also have to accept things to be true.
Yeah. I don't have much more to add. I really liked your monologue on it.
All right, we'll go to our next take then, and this one comes from Scott Adams. He tweets, in 2024, the cost of lying about politics is zero, but the upside potential of a successful hoax is almost unlimited. Now, add in the business models of the corporate news and social media giants who focus on the most provocative stories. Those are usually hoaxes. That system design guarantees 100% fake news on every story that matters. And sure enough, and that's the tweet.
This is very insightful, I think, and Tim Pool from the Timcast podcast has this thing about, because people debate about whether or not the current craziness that we see on like university campuses and in general young adults was that perpetuated by the school system and the university system and the ideologies that propagated through that, or is it propagated by the social media algorithm and the incentives that it was set up? And he makes the argument that he's like, look, like, people will say things like, oh, like cops are killing black people all over the place all the time, when obviously the data displays something much contrary to that, that it's about even, if not more, actually skewed in certain ways to other races. And but Tim Pool's point is that, like, oh, well, the social media algorithms are incentivized to show content to people that they engage with and that they want to watch over and over and share. And those three characteristics are usually bolstered if the content makes them outraged. And what is more outraging than, the narrative and the concept that some poor person has been unjustly hurt? And in some cases it has, right? And in many cases, when it's on video, it truly has been, but that's not actually representative of the actual reality that's going on. And because of that, people see all these videos, and then people have grown up that are now in university seeing these videos and being outraged and having it put in front of their face all the time. And so I don't think that's the 100% explanation of what we're seeing on university campuses and with young people, but the praxeology of it, that the incentives that line up and how it all plays out makes sense to me. And in the same way, I mean, it's even, there's less variables and less hoops to jump through to see the point of Scott's post right here, which is, the news, the corporate news and is trying to gain revenue. They gain revenue by having eyeballs. And what gets eyeballs? It's through provocative stories like he lays out. And so that's why when you look at like Ukraine, which is crazy on its own, but it's like, hey, if everyone is trying to do provocative stories, then if everyone has good visibility on it in Ukraine in one way or another, then the only way to like get an edge over your competition is to have other crazy stories. And so that's where you get things like the Ghost of Kiev or the Snake Island myths, that come out of the news, and they're posting them, and it's whoever posts them first is the one that's going to get the majority benefit. And then, like Scott says, it all turns out to be fake. So that's what makes it so untrustworthy. And the reason why alternative media platforms that don't necessarily rely on like eyeballs being outraged and being there for the 45 seconds that they've got, but are going to listen to a long-term conversation with arguments played out, those platforms are doing better. Because people, and they are more accurate because they're not incentivized to do something fake. They're actually incentivized to try and have a discussion about the truth and get to the most accurate analysis that they can.
Yeah, I think that's completely right. I also think that the interesting thing is the how he mentions the cost of lying in politics is zero. And
yeah,
the thing that's striking to me is that you could argue that with corporate media structures, there's never going to be consequence to them lying because of the outrage that you build, and it's a private company and they're there for money. But when you think about it, I haven't fully fleshed out this thought, to be fair. So forgive me if I'm missing something. But if you have a government that is actually responsive to people, because I think right now we have a pretty ineffectively, like our response to the federal government is pretty ineffective. There's so many bureaucrats, there's so many layers and levels, and even if you are able to vote out the bad people and get good people in there's so much fighting against them regardless, that um, I begin to wonder that if you had a system that was more responsive, then you would be able to see that if the media is covering for things or uh, they are deceiving, there would be some level of, well, I'm gonna reject what that media coverage is doing, and that's what we're seeing right now. A lot of people leaving, and then also we're gonna change things in the government. We're gonna call them out or whatever, and then you're gonna see an honest media have to adapt to a new government and to a new thing. uh it just seems like right now you kind of have a bad media system and a bad government that's untouchable, and the government covers for the media and the media covers for the government, and because there's no effectual change point, because the government is pretty inculcated and insulated, and the media, because the government is untouchable and can cover for itself, as long as the media is covering for it, there's no
Mm.
need for a large population to even tear down the wall that the media creates. So there's no mechanism to check the media. It just feels like they cover for each other, but ultimately the system that's supposed to be representative and supposed to be able to have change, the government isn't affected there, and because of that, they're going out of their way, using the powers that be to cover for the media companies. I mean, it just seems like it's this self-feeding cycle, and you have to break it somewhere. And I tend to think that even if you were to create some sort of law or some kind of um, regulation, like Texas and Florida tried to do with the social media companies, it feels like unless you actually get the corrupt government structures out of there, all they're going to do is manipulate the companies to comply with those laws and work their way around them, but still cover for themselves. When you have one of the players having the force of law at their heels, it seems to me like that's the one you need to tackle by taking down and removing. And when you get rid of a bad government that's corrupt and untouchable, the media's protection, that the dishonest media's protection, will naturally follow through, and they'll either have to adapt and start being a little bit more truthful, or they will fade away and new people will take their place. You're seeing that a little bit right now with alternate media, like we're seeing. And so one part of that equation is dropping, but the problem is that even still, the federal government is the one that's more important to drop, and we're having a harder time of actually reducing. Even now, as people are more and more unhappy with it, they're doing things like banning TikTok and sending our money to Ukraine and Israel and all these kinds of things that are just absurd and obscene. So it's frustrating because the market incentive is getting protected, or the media's market is getting protected by the government. Even still, it's the more vulnerable of the two. But I just tend to think that people whose solution to this might be make a law or create a regulation, they kind of miss the point, because the government right now is the one that's protecting the media companies from their lying. And so by doing some kind of regulation or something, I just feel like that's not actually effective, because the enforcement and the creation of these laws is through the very corrupt institution that's protecting it right now anyway. So I'm curious what the maybe conservative solution would be to this, because the liberal solution is make a law. I think the conservative solution probably would be too.
Yeah.
But I just don't think that's effectual for anyone who understands the nature of government.
Yeah. Yeah. You're really good. I don't have any more on this one either.
Okay. All right. Let's move on to our next one. This one comes from Watcher Guru, who says President Biden proposes a 44.6% capital gains tax, the highest in history. The proposal also includes a 25% tax on unrealized gains for high net worth individuals. So this isn't really a take specifically, so much as what do you make of President Biden trying to do this?
Yeah, this is terrible. Like what an awful policy to set in motion. And it people will try and say things like, oh, it's taxing the rich. It's only on people. I think it's the unrealized gains is for high net worth individuals, which have over $1 million in cash or whatever. But it's like, okay, an unrealized gain is the equivalent of paying taxes on a paycheck you have not received yet. And, if you're going to tax unrealized gains, like, shouldn't logically follow that you should also like get a refund for unrealized losses in the stock market? And of course not. They're never going to do that, because they realize like the downside is huge. And so this is a classic example of like our profits, your losses. And, people will say things like, oh, well, it's high net worth individuals, people that are over $1 million, they can afford to pay these taxes. What you don't realize is that the people that create jobs, the people that create businesses, that create opportunity, that invest in things, those are those high net worth individuals. And when you eat into their margin, regardless of whether or not you think they're hoarding wealth or whatever, they're going to be less likely to spend that on things that make the world better for the rest of us. And especially when it's unrealized gains, like that's going to drive different types of investment that is not necessarily very helpful to people that want to take risks or that want to try and innovate. Is going to put money and drive money into safe havens that have some sort of dividend. And so what's ironic is the people that usually complain about, the high net worth individuals and them not investing in the communities, then advocate and praise policies like this, which make it even less likely and incentivize, more of the behavior that they criticize. And this is just such a terrible, not all of the ethics and the principle of whether you should tax unrealized gains aside, like it's still a terrible policy just for the well-being of the country.
Yeah, I mean, I can't think of anything worse off than incentivizing people to spend long-term money or not invest it in the first place.
Yeah.
I mean, you think about just even like the biblical principle of the 7 years of feast and the 7 years of famine from Joseph and that whole thing with Egypt. And it was like, all right, in the years of feast, we put aside all this we store, and then that way in the years of famine, we have that which we draw from. And it's just crazy to me that you would say, all right, here's what we got to do. We have to make sure that when we're putting the money away for the years of famine, whether that's your own personal or even the nation, just the infrastructure build, we need to make sure that we're discouraging that behavior, and we need to make sure that we're taking our share from that. And we, as you and I know, and as we talked about on the last episode, the government doesn't spend this money efficiently. It's not like the government taking that 25% on unrealized gains is going to improve people's lives and going to shaping the world in a positive way. Like that's just not what's going to happen. And so you're essentially losing that 25% if at best, and discouraging growth and bombing children with it at worst. And so all you do is in the macro, you set up conditions for not only individuals, people's wealth and well-being to be worse off, but the whole health of the entire nation. The whole productivity engine of the nation is being just absolutely incentivized to stop saving and preserving and to spend now. There's I just can't think of a worse way to make sure that your children are going to be okay, let alone your own self for retirement. This is just wild to me. And this doesn't just hurt rich people. This hurts lower income individuals too, because even though they don't have necessarily like the capital gains where this kind of thing would take into effect, when you have people and you have resources and you have the money and set aside and resources to invest in your country and your businesses and your societies, then goods become cheaper, services become available, and all these things that help people who maybe they don't have capital gains, so they're not being taxed directly. But when you decrease the availability of those capital gains and resources to be used in an efficient manner, then you take away that ability for prices to come down, for services to be available at lower endpoints.
Yeah.
Like when money is being saved, most of the time, it's not just being put in a vault and untouched. It's being allocated to people who need resources right now and will pay them back at a higher rate later. So the beauty of that is that you have resources that are not currently used, resources that would otherwise be locked up in a silo. They're going to feed people now. But then when you're feeding those people now, they're saying, because I've been fed today, I can make 2 times what I'm eating, and then we can put that back. So I'm getting better off and you get more than you put in. And it's beautiful, it's efficient, it grows, everyone benefits, and this completely spits in the face of that.
Yeah. Yeah, people talk about like the 1%, and who occupies it and everything, and the fact of the matter is that if you live till you're 70 years old and you work a normal job and you put money away and you don't blow it on stuff, chances are by the latter half of your life you will occupy that 1%. The 1% is not necessarily just driven by like jobs or whatever that you've got. It's also driven by time. And most Americans, if they do all those things that I just said, will occupy from their net worth the top stratas of the income and net worth individuals at some point, because that's just the nature of how you build things. And what's funny is, like, to build on that point, that familial wealth is built by that wealth successfully being transferred to other generations, right? So most generational wealth peaks after 7 generations and it's lost within 3. That's kind of an aside that doesn't really matter to the point I'm trying to make, but it is interesting. But like, it's transferred, it builds because people hand it down, and then as each generation at least does the bare minimum to be responsible and not destroy wealth, they're able to come up and get better and better and better until it eventually peaks at some point. And that's how you can have families that arrived here. Like my family, some of my family members, like, are first generation. My father's a first generation immigrant here. And his mom moved with him and my dad's family here and worked and everything. And within 2 generations, you've got family members that are able to own houses, whereas they were very, very poor in the Philippines. The only reason that works is because you can stack wealth and not destroy it. Taxes destroy wealth. And I remember when my grandmother on my mom's side, she worked since high school till she was 60 and retired. Didn't do anything crazy, investment or anything like that special, owned a home and put money in a 401k and withdrew from retirement and everything. When she needed some medical care in the latter half of her life, you are not allowed to draw and receive any benefits from Medicare or Medicaid in old age unless you've spent down most of your assets in liquid net worth. So she paid into those things her entire life, was taxed for them because they needed to invest it and take care of her or whatever. And then in order for her to actually use that, she actually had to make sure she destroyed all of the wealth that she did manage to hold on to, a wealth that she had already been taxed on, by the way. And because of some maneuver and everything, we were able to keep her property and all these other things. But then once she died, then they also tax you on whatever assets you have left after that. So government, when you see a tax, you should see it as destruction of wealth. It is not, because it literally is being put into, like, whatever it is. 60% of our spending is on the military. 60% of what you're being taxed on is getting put into missiles that are being dropped on people all the way across the world that have no issue with you for the most part. So it's literally being blown up and it's wealth being destroyed. And that is wealth that can actually improve people's lives here today, now, as well as generations, down the line, and have huge impact. And they'll try and tell you, oh, you got to manage it and this and stuff. But, like, do you really trust, like, Congress has whatever it is, a 14% approval rate? Would you trust, like, your life's work in one of those person's hands? Like, literally right now, would you don't know them at all, the same relationship that you've got with your congressperson right now, and they say, hey, give me your life's work to manage. Like, no way. No one would ever trust anyone like that. Yet we try to do it every day. And people that are promoting this 44.6% capital gains tax are saying, hey, you need to trust half of your life's work and investment with these folks. If you guys are watching, there's a nice picture of Biden grinning at you. It's like, I wouldn't hand that guy 1% or 0.1% of my life's work to handle.
Yeah, no, I don't think I don't think I have anything more to add. I think you summed it up well. All right, our next take comes from I can't see the full username here, but it's like the feminist turned housewife, probably. Yes. If I had to guess. Yeah, okay. Oh boy. This take reads: you can't tell people they should be celibate and then also tell them they should wait until their 30s to marry. We all know this is setting up people for disaster. Okay. What is your take on this? Is there any context missing?
I don't think
a larger discussion?
No, it was just them posting it. And I think it's just a critique of the wider culture. And, like, what's hard about this take, like, I like it in some ways. I very much dislike it in others. I like the general principle, which is like, hey, you should be celibate. Like, I waited till I was married to be intimate with someone, my wife, and I got married at 23 or whatever, which is kind of late by traditional standards in some ways. But, like, I think this is misdiagnosing the problem. And because it misdiagnoses the problem, it definitely doesn't provide the right solution. And even though it has elements of the solution, it's like, yes, you should be celibate. And you should be celibate because you shouldn't be, getting intimate with people that you're not going to be building a life with. And if you have to wait until you're 30 to find that person, then so be it. But the emphasis should be on like, hey, I'm purposely looking to build a life and a family with someone. That could happen as early as it should, in terms of as you're an adult, and that can happen as late as it should. Like, it's not supposed to be something where it's like, oh, you need to be married by the time you're 20, and if you're not married by the time you're 20, then you're a failure. It's like, no, it's just as important to be married to the right person as it is to marry at all. It's very, very bad to be married to the wrong person. And celibacy and saving yourself for marriage is part of reinforcing that goal and making sure that you are preserved for your future spouse, and you don't carry as much baggage, as least amount of baggage as you possibly can into it. And so I'm not really on board all the way with like these people who's like, everyone needs to be married by the time they're 18, arranged marriages. And by the time you're 18 or even 20 or 21 or whatever, it's like, by the time I was 23, I was such a different person than when I was 18 years old. And who I would have chosen at 18 is much different than who I would have chosen at 23, because by the time, at least in our culture right now, by the time you're 23, you've kind of started to figure out at least maybe the direction you're going if you're somewhat mature. A lot of people don't find their direction until they're 30, but the problem in our culture is not that people are not marrying too young or something like that. It's or marrying too old. It's that like people are not ready to be married at age 23. They should be ready to be married at 23, but they're not. And if they're not ready, then you shouldn't get married.
Yeah,
you also shouldn't have sex.
I was gonna say, I'm not sure I wish I knew what she was aiming at, because the other way you can read this is almost as an apology for sort of, I don't know, like, I guess this is more of a critique on people who are saying you should wait to marry, and this is an exhortation to marry young. Is that maybe
that is in line with this person's account?
Okay,
is
because
marry
I wasn't
young.
sure if this was one of those takes that's like, oh, I can't think of her name right now. She's that
Pearl,
person
whatever.
Pearl,
Yeah.
where her whole thing would, like, if this was a tweet coming from her, I would think it would be an exhortation to have premarital sex, right? That's what it would seem to me. So if as long as that's not an exhortation, I think it's probably a little bit better. But I agree that part of the issue of high divorce rates comes when people marry without consideration. And I think that people will talk now about, oh well, we're so down in so much lower in divorce rates than we once were, but also we're in much lower marriage rates than we once were, and people are now just jumping to the point of moving in with each other. And so my thought is, like, I think that there's right now there is a hyper focus on sexualization of younger people, and I don't like that. I don't like how much our media, including kids media, is focused on this idea of children being in relationships or wanting to dress up to look attractive to the other gender. Like just in general, to me, the fact that kids media focuses so much more on that than I would expect or even be comfortable with. It makes me think that a lot of the problems is that kids are being pressured into thinking that this decision, like, one, you're inadequate if you aren't getting married or if you aren't with a partner. And that makes people then feel, okay, I don't have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, therefore I'm inadequate and I'm desperate. And once I get a boyfriend or girlfriend, I will finally be happy. This means that they're not building themselves up. They're not working on their own character. They're also viewing the relationship as something that they get for themselves. Whereas a relationship that leads to marriage should be a matter of how I can serve this other person and how I can sacrifice everything I have because of my love for this person. And so then what happens is you incentivize younger marriages that are being created for the wrong reasons and with the wrong expectations.
Yes.
And so if we have a culture that is more focused on the idea of, this is an act of service, this is an act of what I can do for the other person, then maybe this take I would be a little bit more comfortable with. But as it stands, we don't live in that culture. And I think that you're right. Like the most important thing is, I think, teaching that to people rather than saying, oh, you need to worry about marrying young or old, or rather than the age, we need to just reorient our whole culture into what marriage actually is and what its purpose is and how it should function. And once we get there, then we can focus on things like, telling people to be celibate or not. And well, I mean, be celibate, but I mean, whether or not the age range you're recommending is helpful to that celibacy or not. I think right now you're just in the worst of both worlds, because it doesn't matter if you're young or old. the celibacy message is not communicating, because people are viewing marriage like, that's the other crazy thing
Yeah.
about this, is that this take, and I don't know that I want to impute this motive on her specifically, but heard people make the argument that it's like, and it seems like this is what this one is making, is that oh man, young people are just gonna have sex. That's just how it's gonna be. And so if you want the celibacy to be preserved, then they have to get married young. So you have to marry them right away so that they don't fall into sin. And to me, that's kind of like almost Pharisaical reasoning of the law, rather than understanding the context and application of the law. Where the application of the law for premarital sex is that, yes, sex is a holy thing that should be between a married man and a married woman, but also that it is an act of service, and the purpose of that is not a self-gratifying thing. And so if your whole thing is the purpose of marriage is sex, and they're gonna have sex, so you have to marry early, then you're missing the point of what procreation and sex is about even there. And so even then you're incentivizing the union for the wrong reasons, that is going to end up leading into divorce or something wrong. So I think that the framing of this issue just feeds into the broader cultural problem I have, which is a misunderstanding of the purpose of marriage and the purpose of relationship, and how your position should be in facing that. So I think that this take is at best unhelpful and addressing the wrong problem, and at worst encouraging the setups of the problems that we live in, and buying right into the narrative lie that our culture is being taught, whether or not they realize it.
It kind of reminds me of the type of error that this person is making is kind of like missionaries, like youth missionary groups that will go to a foreign country and they'll go paint a church, and that's what they paint every single year. When in reality, like, to actually make the world better there, something like microfinancing for business owners or something like that would be better.
Yeah.
And so it's like, yeah, like the church is in disarray and it definitely needs a paint job, but you painting the church doesn't actually make it possible for the people to have the resources to paint the church in the future. And with this celibacy thing, it's like, yes, you're right. Like, we can't be telling people they should be celibate and then, oh, you need to wait till you're 30 because you're not mature enough till you're 30 to be married. Like, yes, that is going to lead to frustration because there are biological urges that are part of our design that start accruing very early in life, much earlier than 30. And if those are suppressed, that is like a really hard and difficult thing. But the actual addressing of that is to be like, well, why are people not ready to be married until they are 30? And it's like, well, it's because people are selfish, and we've been taught selfishness, and we've taught that marriage is only supposed to make you happy. And so therefore, when we're looking at partners and we're arranging our lives and setting them up from the age of 18 on, like, we're not setting them up in a way that sets us up to be able to be married by the time we're 20, 21, 22, 23, because we have all these other types of priorities. And, you know, I grew up in, like, my family was very healthy in terms of its view on marriage and how these things were. But there was also a very big emphasis on, like, hey, like, you should go accomplish, you know, dreams and things like that before you get married. And, like, it was all meant in good faith. And I'm grateful. Like, my parents did a wonderful job. But, like, that plus the culture's overemphasis on, like, individualism and not kind of pushing aside family until it's convenient, definitely led something in me to be like, oh, like, I arranged my life in such a way that I wasn't able or had the right mindset to be married until I was 23. And I remember very specifically, like, when I was getting ready to propose to my wife, like, certain implications of what it meant to be married, in terms of what it limited and what it would require of me, and what it required of, like, the number of things I would have to die to within myself and give up within myself, started to become apparent. And it hurt. It's really painful. And it feels so wrong because you've been told your whole life that, oh, you need to steward and protect and nurture these levels of individualism in you, and anything that threatens that is bad. And so you're going to feel that when you're getting married, because, like, yes, part of you as an individual has to die so that you as a couple can actually live. And I'm glad that, like, all the other circumstances in my life had led me to be able to, like, deal with that properly. But if I didn't have those, and I didn't have a great family, I didn't have a great community that had been encouraging me in various ways and helping me become someone that was ready to be married, like, I could very well see that, like, oh, I'd bail on that, or I'd be like, no, I shouldn't get married until I'm like 30. And so all that to say, this person would have done a better job if they just said that, basically, like, hey, we should be asking ourselves the question: why are people not ready to be married at 23 versus like, they should be celibate and wait till they're 30, or they should be celibate and just get married at 20 so they don't have sex or whatever before they're married. Like, that's not helpful at all.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, I think we have one more here, and this comes from former Representative Justin Amash, now running for Michigan's Senate seat. He tweets, "The TikTok legislation, which Biden just signed into law, is about limiting and controlling speech. The point is to intimidate U.S. owners of social media companies with a threat of forced divestment if they don't comply with unlawful government demands. Play ball or face accusations, you are subject to the to the direction or control of a foreign adversary. The next administration must work with Congress to repeal it." All right, what do you make of his take?
Yeah, this is good. I find the whole TikTok thing like pretty funny because it's like the Bugs Bunny, like ours versus yours, or meme where it's like the American flag when it's like it's capitalism when it's time for us, and it's communism when I need everything from me. And like the U.S. government is so funny in that it's like, hey, we can monitor you as long as you're U.S. based. Like U.S. based companies will spy on you, but if you're not, if it's a different country that's spying on you, then no, that's a no go. And anyone that thinks that like the amount of nefarious data collection that's going to occur on TikTok is going to be less because now it's US based, or that there's going to be less, it's going to hamper any of the Chinese abilities to gather data is just silly. The other aspect of it too, that he makes a good point on is, and people would bring this up about Twitter and other places, specifically because I identify as libertarian in my political ideology. They're like, oh, well, the free market can't solve the types of censorship, like that censorship, that Twitter's a private company. And it's like, then you go look at this, and then you look at the way that all the heads of all of these companies were dragged before Congress. And it's like, yeah, this is literally the big stick, as he's saying here, that they hold over all of the heads of all of these companies. It's like, you do what we say, even if we're not explicitly stating it, we're saying, hey, we think it would be a good idea, for you to censor this type of content, or we're concerned about this type of content. It comes at the end of the threat of a stick of saying, we're going to accuse you of foreign control by a foreign adversary. And this is just another way to add to the list of things that they can pin these companies with when it becomes convenient.
Yeah, and the crazy thing that is super critical to remember is when he says, face the accusation of being called out as, oh, you're a subject to the direct or control of a foreign adversary. That's not just him saying, the government is liable to do this. That is the actual language of the bill, is that it says not only that, you're owned by these countries, or you're owned by, but that you are controlled by an individual who is compromised from. Like, basically they can just accuse you of being compromised by a country, even if you have no you're not a citizen of there, you don't live there. As long as you are accused of being compromised, the federal government can accuse you of this, and then the bureaucracies behind the scenes can control that and approve it. Defenders of this legislation will say things like, well, it has to bypass all these numbers of checks, and it has to get approved by these regulatory agencies. And it's like, yeah, well, yeah,
like FISA warrants, right? Like it's
right. I was gonna say, it's like, yeah, I mean, are we just all of a sudden okay with unelected bureaucrats being in control of that? I can't imagine anyone who's on to the right of Karl Marx believing that the federal bureaucrats have anyone's interest in mind but themselves. So if that means saying that, oh, X person is compromised by Russia, therefore we have to divest their company, like, of course they're going to approve that. So yeah, it's not just a fear-mongering scare tactic. It's built in to the actual law, really, into the right. And of course, the way that this got passed, for anyone who's unfamiliar, is this was added as an amendment to the bill that would fund Ukraine and Israel. So it's not even in its own.
As per usual, let's sneak as much in as we possibly can, and that should answer your question about whether or not the people that want to do this are going to be above board in terms of their approval of things and making sure it goes through. You know, what I find funny about like being able to accuse some of like a foreign adversary, it's kind of like when they like the catch-all for getting someone on criminal charges is like, oh, racketeering. You know, it's like you can make that apply to any sort of scenario so that you can kind of get them in and arrest them and everything like that. And in the same way, if anyone has ever looked at how ridiculous the entire Trump FISA warrant was issued in terms of like, they're like, oh yeah, like Carter Page is he's a foreign agent, you know, or whatever, and he's known by the CIA to be a foreign agent, and that's how they explained it to the court. And it's like, oh well, the CIA actually told the FBI that like, oh no, Carter Page is actually he's one of our assets, and when the Russians contacted him, he came back to us to tell us about it. But the FBI specifically omitted that from their application for a FISA warrant. And so if you don't think the same sort of silly games and dishonest games are going to be played with this sort of stuff to force tech companies to do their bidding, I mean, I don't know. I've got a bridge to sell you somewhere.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And the other thing that's just very funny is all of the accusations about the other thing people who support this will bring up is accusations about, oh, it's Chinese content is suppressing X, Y, or Z. That's also actually a very dangerous precedent. Something I haven't heard people talk about a lot is they're saying that a foreign country should not be able to control what is or isn't suppressed. But that is a very easy, that's an even easier in to say, well, if, for instance, Twitter is, you could say Elon Musk is compromised by the Chinese, and therefore if he was or wasn't suppressing things, or if he's just letting algorithmic recommendations happen to users based on what they have or have not liked or disliked, that counts as suppression. He has a lot of shareholders in China because of Tesla, therefore he's Chinese compromised, therefore he's China's in control of the suppression or non-suppression of data here. The broad terms that they use for things such as suppression of information or whatnot, that's really scary and problematic because it creates just more inroads. So I genuinely would recommend most people be extra cautious and careful about supporting this, even if you're worried about things like China and the communist Chinese threat and all these kinds of things that can seem very scary. It's just such an easy rabbit hole to go down, where you say you justify one level of sort of privacy or other invasion and then say, well, it's okay because there's a big threat internationally, but it always turns on ourselves. That's what we see time and time again.
Yeah.
All right. That's it for this episode. Thanks so much for tuning in. We appreciate you guys. Leave a comment, leave a like if you enjoyed the episode. Helps us out a ton. We'll catch you on the next one.